Then Rothschild came and planted the vineyards. And Carmel, the root of Carmel is caramel, was the first caramel, God's vineyard.
Yeah.
Was the first commercial winery, which was built in 1890. The first vineyards were from 1882. And Carmel distinguished itself by being eventually the first winery to make quality dry wines, but not world-class wines. I noticed in a previous podcast, they forgot Carmel. Although Carmel was way ahead of all the other Californian wineries in making dry wine. And the other thing about Carmel is three future prime ministers of Israel worked at Carmel, which is totally unique. Now, I've been in this business, I don't know how many years, and every time I give a talk or a tour, I mention the three prime ministers. And despite I've done this for so many years, every time I ask for people, give me three prime ministers that have worked for Carmel, no one ever has got the right answer, ever. So I will tell you for free who the three are. One was David Ben-Gurion. Second was Levi Eshkol, who worked in the vineyards surrounding Rishon LeZion. And the third, believe it or not, was Ehud Olmert. So I don't know many companies around the world that would have one prime minister, let alone three that worked for him.
It's funny, the middle one, Eshkol, I mean, that's his last name.
Yeah, sure. And he, of course, was an agriculturist. Ben-Gurion, it was just a job between jobs. But what's interesting about Ben-Gurion is he worked in the winery. And he caused a lot of trouble in the winery. People say he caused led the first strike. He was very competitive. And there's a story goes that he bet his colleagues that he could stand on the grapes, tread the grapes longer than they could. And he lasted 3 days nonstop.
Oh, wow.
Obviously with a break at night, I suppose. And he won his bet. But the smell of wine fermenting made him so nauseous, he couldn't drink wine for years afterwards.
Wow.
And it sounds like folklore, but it's in one of his books. So it must be true. But the interesting thing about that, Rabbi Drew, is that he worked in the winery and he wasn't a religious Jew. And so this brings me to another point. Now, today in a kosher winery, the workers all have to be Shomrei Shabbat. And they have to be approved by the rabbi of the winery. In those days, you didn't have to be Shomrei Shabbat. You could be religious. You could be Jewish, and they knew you were Jewish. And until the 1980s, it was lax. People who were Jewish could say, "Oh, I'll put on a kippah. I'll go into the winery and work." And it was okay. And I know this from Carmel, which was the be-all and end-all of kashrut in wine and the biggest winery. And it only started getting more competitive and stricter in 1983 with the founding of Shas, the Sephardi party. And suddenly kashrut started to become more competitive, started to have more business potential. And everyone started getting stricter.